Vamos a reanudar la sesión. Ya os he comentado que iba a haber un pequeño cambio. En lugar de Gabriele Finaldi, pues va a ser Philipp Demandt, director de los museos de Frankfurt, quien nos hable a continuación. La verdad es que es difícil encontrar a alguien que tenga una formación más adecuada para dirigir un museo, puesto que Philipp es licenciado en Derecho y Administración de Empresas, pero también en Historia del Arte y Arqueología Clásica. La verdad que en ese sentido lo tiene todo y las dos vertientes las ha desarrollado a lo largo de su carrera. Creó y dirigió la revista Ars Prototo y la serie de publicaciones académicas Patrimonia y numerosos artículos, evidentemente, sobre la historia del arte, y entre sus muchos responsabilidades en el mundo de los museos alemán, pues hay que destacar que en el año 2012 fue nombrado director de la Alte National Gallery de Berlín y que desde 2016 es el director del Städel Museum de Frankfurt y de los museos de Frankfurt. Así que muchas gracias, Philipp, todo tuyo.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Miguel, I would like to thank you very much for the friendly and honorable invitation to speak here at this place on the occasion of this great jubilee, not to mention of a house that's one of my favorite museums in the world, and a city that's been my undisputed favorite city for many, many years, even decades. Yes, Madrid, indeed, there's no better place than Madrid. Even all my friends, I'm from Berlin, prefer to go to Barcelona, I guess, for party reasons. I've always felt drawn to Madrid, not only because there's nothing, absolutely nothing, better than Velázquez, but also because of hundreds of thousands of other things. You, however, ladies and gentlemen, know this all much better than I do, and now on this day you certainly wouldn't want to listen to a man from Frankfurt who lectures on the advantages of Madrid. Rather, you would like to hear an answer to the question, why is this man actually standing here? New York, St. Petersburg, Vienna, Florence, London, Paris, Edinburgh, and Rome, these are the cities and world capitals of art whose best and largest museums have sent their directors to Madrid to pay their respects to the Prado on the occasion of this World's Museums Bicentenary. And now, who's talking to you from Germany? No one from Berlin, from Munich or Dresden, all of them respectful world capitals of art as well, with their rich, old and abundant collections of art. No, it's me coming from Frankfurt. Frankfurt, the city most of you know as the largest airport on continental Europe, or as one of the continental financial capitals with a skyline like New York or miniature, of course, or maybe as that city about whose train station was said you could transfer to anywhere but never get out except to buy drugs or get mugged or both. Sure, there is art and culture in Frankfurt, but for a long time this has been with a view to the past, not to the present, and moreover with less consideration of fine arts, but rather of philosophy and literature. First and foremost, of course, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose birth in Frankfurt is still the source of infinite pride for the Frankfurters today, even though he left the city at the age of 16. And there were Arthur Schopenhauer, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and the so-called Frankfurt School, of course, and the famous Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, the newspaper every one of you knows, of course. And yet, what else could I say? It is a representative of Frankfurt that stands before you today with some justification. And a look at the German press proves this to be true. In recent years, the press had not missed an opportunity to comment on Frankfurt's cultural transformation and ascent. Frankfurt as Germany's premier news weekly, the Die Zeit, wrote, has long been the true German capital of art. Or to say it in the words of another newspaper, while Germany's major museums still compete in the Bundesliga, Frankfurt is already playing in the Champions League. The Germans are almost as crazy about football as the Spanish. And why that is so, and perhaps even rightly so, and how and why this ascent took place, what it meant to Frankfurt as a city, and what challenges and plans we are now facing in Frankfurt with our most important museums, the Städel Museum, the Schirn Kunsthalle, and the Liebieghaus Sculpture Collection. That is what I came to tell you about today. Only those who know where they came from know where they are going, they said. And that applies for Frankfurt in particular. After all, the history and characteristics of the city in general, and those of the Städel Museum in particular, are so unusual for Germany and should therefore be briefly outlined here, but don't worry, this won't be a lesson in history, at least not a long one. As you know, Germany is a federal state. For centuries, the country consisted of dozens of sovereign kingdoms and principalities, a right patchwork rug. However, this fragmentation, which had lasted for centuries, even though it was politically and economically very detrimental to the development of the country, had a tremendously refreshing effect on the development of culture. And this simply because the sovereigns, however small their territory, were competing against each other. Everyone wanted a little Versailles. A further advantage of this fragmentation was the fact that artists who did not feel comfortable, at liberty, or valued under one sovereign could quickly switch to another, more artistically minded one, so that certain principalities, think of Weimar, for instance, would turn into downright courts of muses. Also, the famous Frankfurt-born Johann Wolfgang von Goethe spent almost his entire life there, a giant in a dwarf's house, but a very comfortable one. Even today, while Germany has been a federal state with 16 federal states since 1990, the historical structure is very clearly reflected in the cultural landscape. The density of cultural institutions is unparalleled worldwide. Even though the former royal residence cities no longer exist as such, their theaters, operas, and above all, their museums have been preserved. Unlike other countries, Germany today does not have an art capital that dominates everything with a national gallery that towers above all other museums, but rather, if you like, national galleries by a dozen, rich collections often only an hour drives apart. You most likely know the museums in Munich, Dresden, and Berlin and Hamburg, of course, but no less important museums can still be found in Braunschweig and Kassel, in Leipzig and Chemnitz, in Karlsruhe and Stuttgart, in Düsseldorf and Cologne, in Mannheim and Gotha, and so on and so forth. In addition to the multitude of sovereign principalities, however, a further German characteristic were the so-called free imperial cities. Rather than to any particular individual sovereign, these cities were subject directly to the emperor, and yet, apart from that, self-governed. Aachen, Augsburg, and Hamburg were such cities, and to get to the point, Frankfurt as well. However, the historical and cultural development of these cities was generally different from that of the royal residence cities. On the one hand, many of these imperial cities were strongly focused on trade. On the other hand, they lacked the aforementioned princely regent who competed in art and culture with the respective neighboring rulers and who would hence sacrifice the shirt of their back for the local display of splendor. Thus, to this day, There are no royal collections with the corresponding characteristics in these former imperial cities. However, museums would be established in these cities as well. And there was another reason for this. It was the prospering middle classes in the wake of industrialization, the growing middle class pride, that led to the foundation of museums in these cities, but not until the middle or the end of the 19th century. The collections of these bourgeois museums, however, differ fundamentally from those with a courtly background. The collection of the Hamburger Kunsthalle is therefore by no means similar to that of the Munich Pinakothek. And the same goes for Frankfurt. The Städel Museum, you see the backside here in Frankfurt, is a historical exception in the German museum landscape. And this is still true today. And it is true in many respects. While in other German cities, also in the royal residences, the foundation of museums began around 1930 or 1940, even though the existing collections of the courts were, of course, much older and sometimes already accessible. The inception of the Städel Museum took place as early as 1815, that is immediately after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, still strongly under the influence of the Enlightenment and as well as the opening of the Louvre in Paris. In Frankfurt, there is the temporal peculiarity on the one hand. The other unique aspect is the actual founder himself, because in this case, it was not a sovereign or an art association, but one individual citizen who founded a museum. To this day, we bear the name of our museum founder. It was the Frankfurt merchant and banker Johann Friedrich Städel who in 1815 set up a trust in his will, which was to house his own significant art collection and make it accessible to the citizens of Frankfurt in a very special art institute. The trust was intentionally kept away from the hands of the city government and was to be headed by a board of 5, quote, worthy persons. At the same time of his death, Städel owned 476 paintings, around 4,600 drawings, and 10,000 prints, as well as a considerable fortune. As a further peculiarity, the founder decided that his collection should not be regarded as something static and therefore preserved accordingly, but that it should be expanded through acquisitions and even decreased through sales if better art were to be acquired from the proceeds. Quite unique about the founding of our museum is the fact that Städel's intentions went far beyond the establishment of a public museum. Since his views were strongly rooted in the idea of humanity, the Enlightenment, and public education, Städel also decreed in his last will and testament the foundation of an art academy associated to the museum. And this way, a unique combination of a museum and an educational institution was created in Europe. Even today, the Städel Schule, one of Germany's leading art academies with an international reputation, with, among others, Max Beckmann as one of its professors, is still located on the grounds of the Städel Museum, which in its present form can be traced back to a new building opened in 1878. The Städel Museum has remained a private foundation to this day. This too is unique. No museum in this size and importance in Germany is still based on such a construction. Sooner or later, all these museums slipped under the umbrella of public authorities. Not so the Städel, with serious consequences for our structure and our work today. The Städel Museum receives only about 15% of its total budget in form of public grants. We have to earn about 85% of our expenses ourselves, a figure unique in Germany. Yet, a museum is not a business enterprise, neither should it be. Culture is not profitable, at least not in this way. So how does the Städel actually work? We manage, as you can see, to generate around 40% of our expenses through income, admissions, museum shop, events. Everything else, more or less 45%, is third-party funding. On the one hand, of course, there is financial support from the city's major banks and companies, but this is far less than it might seem sometimes. Rather, Frankfurt features yet another particularity, because Frankfurt, as a Bürgerstadt, a citizen's town or a civic city, affords itself a Bürgermuseum, a citizen's museum. In fact, most of our donations come from foundations established by private individuals in Frankfurt or from private individuals themselves. For example, this lovely lady, Dagmar Westberg, heiress of the Beiersdorf company. Her great-great-uncle invented Nivea, an energetic woman of the best age who, living alone in a 3-room apartment, quite remarkably told me on her 102nd birthday, when asked whether she did ever want to hire a nurse, not yet, not until later. For 120 years, we have also been associated with the Städelsche Museumsverein, which supports us in acquisitions, restorations, and large-scale exhibitions. With around 8,000 members, it is one of the largest museum associations in Germany. Here, too, a unique characteristic of Frankfurt comes to bear. While the Holocaust, the Second World War, and 40 years of German division have wiped out the middle classes in many East German cities, especially in Berlin, the upper middle class in Frankfurt has been able to recover at least somewhat after the war, so that there are numerous families who have been with us for several generations, lines of tradition that elsewhere have broken. Equally to this day, the Städel is supervised by a foundation board consisting of 5 worthy persons. You can see them here. From 1830 on, a further worthy person was added, that is the director. By the way, as you can see on the photo of a classic work situation of mine, this director also spends around 180% of his working time not with art, but as a charming chatterer in search of money. Due to the particular nature of the Städel as a combination of museum and educational institution, the first 2 Städel directors had been trained artists. Their character and taste were to have a decisive influence on the development of the collection. Both Philipp Veit and Johann David Passavant were committed to the popular style of the Nazarenes in the Germany in the mid-19th century. In other words, the imitation of early Renaissance art. The purchasing policy was likewise guided by this view. You see one great example of the Nazarenes art of the 19th century. Thus, the Romantic Christian focus on the Middle Ages and early Renaissance brought major works into the house, such as Jan van Eyck's Lucca Madonna and precious drawings by Raphael. A few words about the collection of our house today. The Städel is not a universal museum, as far as I would like to use this term. Although we display 700 years of art history, our collection reflects the aspiration and the taste of the German middle classes in the 19th and 20th century. In addition, the house specializes in painting, while sculpture of the period from ancient Egypt to classicism is in the focus of a separate museum just a few meters away from the Städel, the Liebieghaus Sculpture Collection, founded in 1907 and located in a former villa belonging to Baron von Liebig. The aforementioned middle-class taste with a romantic Christian touch, although schooled in courtly manners, is reflected at the Städel by the strong emphasis on the Nordic schools, beginning with one of the most popular images in German history. Every kid knows it, the Paradiesgarten, the little garden of paradise by an upper Rhenish master around 1410, a work that has captivated the viewer for centuries, which, with its concentration and almost childlike bliss. It is above all early Dutch and German painting, van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, Grünewald, Dürer, Altdorfer, and Holbein, that is represented in the collection, followed by paintings of the Netherlandish Golden Age with masterpieces by Rembrandt, Frans Hals, and Vermeer, our famous geographer, which you cannot see in Frankfurt at the moment because it hangs in the Prado right now. Today, the collection of the Städel is distinguished by its completeness. The acquisition of Rembrandt's second largest painting at all, The Blinding of Samson, from a Viennese aristocratic collection, kept the city on tenterhooks in 1905 due to the large sums of money to be raised. The painting is still today somewhat exceptional for the Städel collection due to its unusual format. Most of our paintings are rather small paintings. While the Städel director at the time of its acquisition, the legendary Ludwig Justi, felt inclined to rename the painting The Triumph of Delilah because of its racy content, today, despite or precisely because of the drastic nature of its depiction, it is a major attraction not only for contemporary artists such as, he seems to be a frequent museum visitor, yeah? David Hockney, you've seen him before, who recently came to the Städel only for this one painting, but of course not without visiting Frankfurt's most famous son, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. You know the painting Goethe in the Roman Campagna by Tischbein. It's our Mona Lisa, so to say. It's for me, it's always the icon of the Germans' unfulfilled yearning for the sunny south. Spain and Mallorca in particular may tell you one thing or two about it. Around 1910, the plan matured to expand the museum building from 1878 in order to suitably accommodate the constantly growing collection of modern and contemporary painting. This was in keeping with the founder's letter by Johann Friedrich Städel, who himself has recommended that the collection be steadily developed further. In 1907, the city of Frankfurt decided to build up its own collection of contemporary art and to entrust it to the Städel. This, too, is unique about Frankfurt. The National Gallery in Berlin, for instance, had to wait until the abdication of the German emperor in 1918 before it could directly acquire contemporary works of art. This had previously been prevented by the conservative artistic taste of Wilhelm II. Modern paintings such as Matisse flowers and ceramics reached the Städel very soon. Eventually, in 1911, one of the most famous paintings of modernism arrived at the Städel, Vincent van Gogh's legendary portrait of Dr. Gachet. Finally, in 1921, the rear extension of the Städel, the so-called garden wing, was opened to house the ever-growing collection. An emphasis was placed on works by Max Beckmann, who lived in Frankfurt from 1915 to 1933. In 1937, in the course of the National Socialist degenerate art campaign, the Städel lost almost its entire collection of contemporary avant-garde, an incredible loss. Tens of thousands of artworks branded degenerated were removed from German museums and sold abroad to a profit. Nevertheless, in the post-war period, the Städel was able to close some of these gaps through buybacks and generous donations. Today, again, we are one of the most important collections of German expressionism in the world, with a focus on the works of Max Beckmann and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. I think you had the opportunity to see this amazing self-portrait by Max Beckmann a couple of months ago in the Thyssen. And yet, German museums have never quite recovered from this depredation. The attempt after 1945 to make up for the losses of the once ostracized German and French avant-garde through purchases was only partially successful, and is still obscured today by a second cloud cast by the Nazi era. The fact that many of these paintings, which were acquired from private ownership in the 1950s to the 1990s, had previously belonged to Jewish private collectors who were forced to sell them under duress between 1933 and 1945. Questions of provenance and cases of restitution still occupy us today. Only a few months ago, the Städel Museum was able to reach an agreement with the descendants of the owners of Max Beckmann's Eisgang on whether the painting should remain in the museum. In 1990, the Städel again expanded its area by inaugurating the Peichel building, named after its architect, Gustav Peichel. This expansion stood in the tradition of a quite astonishing development, which strongly reflected the sociological focus of Frankfurt's intellectual life, not only as a result of the 1968 movement, and which was crucially founded by Frankfurt's head of cultural affairs, Hilmar Hoffmann. This deliberate, repeated opening of the museums contributed in the long run to reduce any perceived hurdles for the public visiting the museum. To this day, the Städel Museum, the Schirn Kunsthalle, and the Liebieghaus Sculpture collections have served as role models in Germany for their museum education programs. At the end of the 1970s, Frankfurt discovered its dominant river, the Main, as its lifeline. While the embankment of the river had previously been unused and unsightly, the project of the Museumsufer, the museum embankment, was implemented in 1984 with the opening of the German Architecture Museum. In this epochal urban development project, existing collections were presented newly under the motto Culture for All, and new museums were founded and built along the river Main. Today, around 30 Frankfurt museums are united under the word image trademark Museumsufer Frankfurt. At the same time, a tremendous construction boom began in Frankfurt that continues to this day. The airport had also expanded immensely. The image comparison between the 1960s and today clearly illustrates the changes. Ever more banks, insurance companies, consulting firms, and law firms moved the German or even European headquarters to Frankfurt, Germany's banking metropolis per se. This trend will be further intensified, of course, by Brexit. The city's wide range of cultural attractions, including music with first class, opera, theater, and concert hall, changed as a result of these developments from a soft to a hard location factor. In this context, it is important to bear in mind that Germany is heading for a massive shortage of skilled workers due to demographic developments. the German economy is already suffering from a shortage of qualified personnel. In such a competitive environment, culture adds to the attractiveness and value of a city for people who work and who live there. At the same time, culture has itself become a major employer in Frankfurt. Furthermore, culture, in addition to the important trade fair activities in Frankfurt, has meanwhile become one of the main reasons why tourists from all over the world visit the city. For some years now, a visit to Germany has not been limited to Berlin, Munich, Dresden, or Berlin, but also included Frankfurt, an entirely unthinkable notion 25 years ago. The Städel Museum played an important role in this development. Because of its success story, further museums in Frankfurt have been merged with the Städel over the years. Since 2006, the Städel has been running the Liebieghaus Museum, one of the country's most important sculpture collections. The Liebieghaus has made an international name for itself, above all through polychromy research. As part of this research, the original colors of the antique sculptures, we've seen this before, are examined and reconstructed with state-of-the-art methods. The exhibition, Gods in Color, has been seen by more than 2 million visitors on a grand tour for more than 15 years through 26 museums. In January 2020, the Liebieghaus will once again be presenting the Gods in Color from a different perspective, featuring the latest scientific research. A further interesting aspect of the fact that the director of the Städel Museum, that is myself, is also the director of the Schirn Kunsthalle, although this development originated from the Schirn, not the other way around. Forward was the young Max Hollein, today, as you know, director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who, after his great success as director of the Schirn in 2006, was also appointed director of the Städel Museum. Since then, both houses, which are otherwise two separate organizations, have been run under one and the same director. The Schirn Kunsthalle, opened in 1986, has no collection of its own and is one of the most high-profile exhibition venues in Europe. Today, we focus on 20th century art with regular excursions to the late 19th century, as well as into contemporary art. The Schirn shows large monographic exhibitions such as on René Magritte, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Edvard Munch, to name only a few, as well as thematic exhibitions often focusing on current social issues and matters of relevance. We recently presented a comprehensive exhibition of the art on the Weimar Republic, which was highly topical, not least due to the rise of left-wing and right-wing parties in Germany. The question of whether we were heading for a new Weimar, the time between the two world wars, with all its political and social upheavals, has dominated public discourses for months. Yet another recent exhibition was devoted to the notion of wilderness in the art from modernism to the present day, a show that received particular attention due to the widespread debates about the consequences of climate change. Both the Schirn Kunsthalle and the Städel Museum are characterized by the fact that our orientation is always international. This corresponds to the orientation of Frankfurt in general, a city which, although only the 5th largest in Germany, is perhaps the most international city in Germany today. As a result, many of our exhibitions are created in close cooperations with museums, for example, in London and Paris and Copenhagen, in Bilbao, Zurich or Vienna, in New York, Toronto or Ottawa. Around half of all visits to an art museum in Frankfurt now go to the Städel Museum, the Schirn Kunsthalle, and the Liebieghaus Sculpture Collection, which in their prime years could count around 1 million visitors, 300,000 more than the city's entire population. In other words, Frankfurt also had its Bilbao effect, albeit not with the help of Frank Gehry, but through a multifaceted and nevertheless intensively pursued development over a period of around 25 years. The Städel Museum, on the other hand, was expanded already in 2012 with the inauguration of the grandiose underground garden halls to house the collection of art post-1945. In the spirit of the Städel collection as a collection of German painting in an international context, we consistently pursue our narrative here. Through significant donations, acquisitions, and permanent loans, especially from the collections of Frankfurt banks, the Städel Museum today offers a unique insight into the developments of German painting after World War II. We deliberately focus on the traditional media of painting and sculpture and their potential variations. Furthermore, in the most recent acquisition policy, we are concentrating on a stringent expansion of this narrative, acquiring not only well-known names, but also lesser-known positions, which we deem important. We're also buying cyclically, that means against the current taste of the market, thus avoiding a development whereby museums of contemporary art in recent years have begun to resemble one another like the shopping zones of international airports. The success of the Städel Museum is based on a strategy that is as clear as it is complex. On the one hand, we operate a diverse and target group-specific art education system in the museum's collections, from programs for children to those suffering from dementia, from refugees to art students. Digitalization, in which the Städel has assumed a pioneering position in Germany through a large number of educational offers, plays a particular role. Our aim is to try out and establish new ways of researching, presenting, narrating, and communicating art in a digital space. Above all, there is the aspiration to enable global participation in cultural assets across spatial and temporal boundaries. The digital strategy of the museum comprises a large number of offers, from classical website, the Städel app, to the digital collection, and from online courses on modernism and oral history projects to collection and exhibition films, as well as specific digital offers to the major special exhibitions such as the Digitorials, right up for preparation and post-processing of exhibition visits and our podcasts. Städel, Schirn, and Liebieghaus also set a benchmark in Germany in the field of social media communication. In addition, the Städel Museum presents 3 or 6 special exhibitions a year, 3 of which are unusually large scale. This cycle is unique in Germany. In recent past, we have honored the Grand Masters of our collection in monographic exhibitions: Dürer, Titian, Botticelli, Rubens, Watteau, Monet, Matisse, Bonnat, Baselitz, to name but a few. When I took office in Frankfurt in 2016, we added an additional aspect to the museum's exhibition program that is very important to me and that has a lot to do with my very personal biography. Before I became director of the Old National Gallery in Berlin, on the Berlin Museum's island, I worked for almost 10 years at the Kulturstiftung der Länder, a cultural foundation of the 16 German federal states I mentioned earlier, which have joined together to form a kind of purchasing association. This foundation financially supports all German museums in the acquisition of important works of art. My main task within the foundation was to closely monitor the national and international art and auction market in order to propose works to German museums for purchase. In this way, I've spent years in the art market, art fairs, auction, galleries, and especially reading auction catalogs. That's still one of my favorite doings. The image of art history that emerges in this way is different from that seen in the museums. Numerous artists of the 19th and 20th century are not significant in museums, even though many of them were famous and expensive during their lifetimes. Some of these artists are still extremely valuable on the art market today, but are largely ignored by museums. They are collectors' artists, not museum artists. Other artists, on the other hand, were expensive during their lifetime, but today they are forgotten and sold at very low prices at the art market. I've always been extremely interested in the process behind this phenomena. Who determines which artist is good and who is bad? How do we structure our memory? Who actually determines the canon? How and where is art history actually written, indeed made? Already since the late 1990s, I've been preoccupied with issues that are now becoming, as you know, more and more virulent in the view of the ever-growing public sphere brought about by the internet and the associated challenges to power structures and the desire for participation. The urgency of such an examination of the canon became all the more obvious when I was invited to take over the headquarters of the Berlin National Gallery on Berlin Museum's Island in 2012. More than any other German museum, the National Gallery has pursued the goal of showing only the best of the best in its collection. Everything else has been sold or placed in storage over the years, works, mind you, that in their time were considered the best of the best. And so I discovered that by 1930, the National Gallery had already sold two magnificent paintings by none other than Joaquin Sorolla. And the day I read this in the files, I felt truly depressed. The depots, however, were still full of works by formerly celebrated painters, stars, and grand sculptors, and so I began to reorganize the National Gallery's display collection in Berlin, especially with a view on such an extension of the canon. I was able to explore such questions in depth in Berlin in several special exhibitions, for example, on Anton Graf, once the most famous portrait painter of his time around 1800, or Rembrandt Bugatti, in my opinion, one of the greatest sculptors of all times, who had his first monographic exhibition ever in Berlin in 2014, 100 years after his early death at the age of 31. While the National Gallery in Berlin does not have any special exhibition rooms, the Städel Museum and the Schirn Kunsthalle offer completely different possibilities on several thousand square meters. With my inauguration in Frankfurt, I was able to set in motion my project of discoveries and rediscoveries. The Schirn has long seen itself as a place of discoveries and major exhibitions such as Storm Woman or Woman Impressionist or Splendor and Misery in the Weimar Republic. The focus was not only on many forgotten artists, and especially female artists, but also on the social topicality of the respective theme. Our programmatic series at the Städel recently began with a juxtaposition of Lucian Freud and Frank Auerbach, two artists united by a lifelong friendship. Hang on, you might say now, these are by no means unknown artists, but heroes of British post-war art. And of course, you are right. But they have been never exhibited together in Germany before, and that despite the fact that they both are Germans, a fact that hardly anyone in Germany is aware of. Auerbach and Freud were both born in Berlin, and they both share the fate of having to leave the country because of their Jewish descent. Then we showed an artist who of all the fallen angels is probably one who fell the deepest. Of course, you know him. It's Victor Vasarely. Like no other artist, Victor Vasarely had shaped in the 1960s and 70s these decades an absolutely universal everywhere spirit, which in the end was so omnipresent that everyone had to become fed up with his work. But it is well worth pushing aside your own taste filters. If you do so, you discover an incredible, exciting artist who combines pre-war modernism and post-war modernism, the Bauhaus and the pop art in a unique way. And this is particularly interesting, is viewed quite differently by the generation of the millennials. Today's 20 or 30 years old who didn't grow up with Vasarely, who weren't negatively affected by Vasarely bed sheets and Vasarely wallpapers, this generation is discovering completely different new aspects in Vasarely's work. So that is really my opinion. It's always worth examining once famous artists for their up-to-dateness. The exhibition then went to the Pompidou in Paris. But the biggest surprise success, if I may say so, in the Städel's more recent history was the exhibition by painter Lotte Laserstein. This artist was rather successful in the 1920s and the 1930s with her sensitive portraits, with the broadest sense belong to the so-called Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity. Lotte Laserstein reminds us of the fact that modernism does not automatically mean avant-garde, but that modernism has always been accompanied by a conservative current. Yet another reason to continually question the linearity of art history. Modernism was much more than just a race to abstraction. Lotte Laserstein, in turn, had to leave Germany in 1937 because of her Jewish descent and died in Sweden in 1993 without ever returning to Germany. She was a contemporary of Victor Vasarely. In art history, there's hardly a more impressive way of illustrating what Ernst Bloch called the simultaneousness of the non-simultaneousness. Lotte Laserstein's name had long since been forgotten. Her paintings cost a few hundred euros on the art market. And so the exhibition at the Städel Museum expected perhaps 20 or 30,000 visitors. But it drew to a close with over 132,000 visitors. So what had happened? 100 years after her creative work, the artist had obviously hit a nerve. The exhibition became the talk of the town. It was above all the daughters, the millennials in turn, who told their parents about this show. And so it became a must-see, and quite rightly so. Laserstein's paintings, who mostly depicted women, to whom the artist also in private was more inclined to than men, had revealed an individual feminine view of the female body and the image of the woman in a way that is unprecedented in German art history. At the same time, and this is also very important, her work fell into the era of the new woman, a time that is decisive for every historically thinking woman and every man who thinks in this way, namely the time in which women in Germany gained the right to vote after the end of the First World War and were finally admitted to the art academies to study. And their appearance changed. Sporty women, professional women, women with their own heads in the truest sense of the word. When you think of the boyish, Bobby-like hairstyles at the time, in short, Lotte Laserstein's oeuvre was marked by tragedy and modernity. Some of her sitters could well be sitting opposite you in the subway today. I've personally always been particularly fascinated by the time between 1890 and 1930, because it is socially and politically constitutive for many things that still occupy, shape, or even persecute us today. And it is a time when in art too, a canon has been established that is worth scrutinizing. If you do this, art exhibitions acquire an unforeseen, enlightening, and sometimes painful topicality, a topicality unexpected at first glance. Recently at the Schirn Kunsthalle, for instance, we dedicated a first retrospective to an artist who until today is one of the world's best known and most expensive academically trained landscape painters, and yet for illuminating reasons has never been exhibited in a large museum. His name is Wilhelm Kunert. Wilhelm Kunert, who is still admired today, particularly in Great Britain and in the United States, as a pioneer of wildlife art, was the first German painter who at the beginning of the 20th century forced his way deep into the savannas and the former colony of German East Africa. With the pictures he painted there and then later in his Berlin studio, he shaped like no other artist the notion of Africa created in the Northern Hemisphere. Even today, safari iconography from tourism, you can see this very clearly, from tourism commercials to popular film formats is based on pictorial compositions devised by the painter Wilhelm Kunert. In this exhibition and the accompanying catalogue, however, we not only addressed his view of the African animal and the African landscape, but also the tremendously topical historical background of his art. For, of course, the painter's career was deeply rooted in the oppressive system of colonialism on the one hand, and in the unappealing passion for big game hunting on the other, just as it is still practiced today by people with whom one doesn't necessarily want to be friends with. Exhibitions like these, however, are always a balancing act that requires some courage. This courage does not exactly increase in the museum world. An exhibition such as King of the Animals, Wilhelm Kunert and the Image of Africa, on the one hand, sheds light on a subject that is to this day virtually unknown to a larger public in Germany, the short but unfortunate chapter of German colonial rule in East Africa. On the other hand, however, it touches upon sentiments that are now expressed more spontaneously, directly, and sometimes furiously than just a few years ago, particularly on social media. As such, the exhibition was welcomed by large sections of the public from the point of view of current discourses. It even made it to the page 1 of the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, but also received criticism from the black community and parts from the direction of post-colonial studies. Above all, the exhibition's treatment of the colonial aspect did not go far enough for these critics. Another point of criticism related to the attitude of the painter himself, who, not without justification, was accused of racism. Here, current experiences of discrimination on the part of the critics merged with historicity. Other critics, in turn, did not perceive the painter's outstanding artistic achievement as best exemplified by the addition of the biographical and political circumstances in which he came into being, but rather, that is really interesting, rather as degraded. As a curator, the great positive response of the exhibition, coupled with criticism from both sides, has reassured me that I had chosen the right approach for this balancing act. Nevertheless, with these topics, we are entering a field that probably preoccupies all museums at present, and that would require more than just a lecture like mine to order and stake out. Indeed, we are facing a real paradigm shift. In addition to the current omnipresent colonial aspect, which no longer affects cultural historical museums, the recent eruption of the themes of racism and sexism has in the meantime confronted museums with discussions worldwide on the limits of artistic freedom. We've heard that before. The question of the separation of artist and work, as well as the notion of power, not to mention the question of the origin of sponsorship money. Who today, in times of expanding public spheres, determines how history is written, also art history? Where are the boundaries between artistic freedom, political correctness, and self-censorship? Not 1 week passes in Germany without a heated discussion in the media. There was broad criticism of Michael Jackson and the fine arts in Bonn, opened shortly after the pedophilia revelations, right up to Emil Nolde, a German legend, the artist during the Nazi regime, an exhibition in Berlin that focused on the painter's well-known sympathy for the National Socialists who incidentally rejected and persecuted him. The climax of the heated debate, conducted with the infamous German diligence, was finally the unnerved removal of 2 Nolde paintings from the offices of none other than the Chancellor Angela Merkel, who could not, should not, or would not enjoy the flowers and waves by the painter any longer. By the way, pictures by Emil Nolde had been removed once before for precisely the opposite reasons. In 1937, when the Nazi cultural propaganda scattered them to the winds as degenerate and against the German spirit, history, ladies and gentlemen, bears strange analogies. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that with this tour d'horizon through more than 200 years of Frankfurt's past, present, and future, I've been able to give you a small overview of Frankfurt, which is, I quote it again and again, the true German art capital. Not only about what we've already achieved in Frankfurt, but also about what we are currently facing as a museum and what we will do in the future. And as for our exhibition program, which has made us widely known, don't worry, Frankfurt will by no means turn into the city of fallen angels of art, even though you can look forward to many new discoveries, not least this fall at the Schirn Kunsthalle with a retrospective of the pioneer of abstract expressionism, Lee Krasner, who was so much more than just Jackson Pollock's wife, or the exhibition of the monumental tapestries by Hannah Rüggen, Norway's best-known female artist, whose unique oeuvre will also be on view in the Schirn this autumn. This will be followed in spring by the major exhibition, Fantastic Women, about female surrealist artists from Meret Oppenheim to Louise Bourgeois. And at the Städel Museum in the autumn of 2020, we are planning an exhibition on Rembrandt's early years in Amsterdam, and we are absolutely delighted to be able to show on this occasion in Frankfurt this magnificent Judith from the Prado. Currently, however, we are holding our breath in Frankfurt as the largest and most elaborate exhibition in the history of the Städel Museum opens on 23rd of October, Making Van Gogh a German Love Story. With this show, we tell a truly extraordinary story. Although today the enthusiasm for Vincent van Gogh may be an almost global phenomenon, it was an entirely different story 100 years ago. Our exhibition illuminates the role that Germany played in the 1910s and 1920s in the emergence of the Van Gogh myth. Initially, it was mainly the efforts of his sister-in-law, Johanna, in Holland, who ensured that the painter did not fade into oblivion after his death. But soon, it was above all gallery owners, artists, collectors, museum directors, and authors in Germany, many of them of Jewish faith, who became enthusiastic about Van Gogh and courageously collected him. Around 1914, 120 of his paintings were eventually held in German collections, yet not without quite some hostility from conservative and nationalist forces. At the same time, Van Gogh's influence on the emergence of German Expressionism was so obvious that Emil Nolde remarked that the Artists' Association Brücke should actually be called Van Goghiana. In Frankfurt, we will tell the story of this passion for Van Gogh with all its ups and downs, a passion that has resulted in many innovations in art, but which also has been falsified, instrumentalized, politicized, ideologized, and which came to an end with the world economic crisis and ultimately the iconoclasm of degenerate art. I think nowadays there are 7 Van Gogh paintings in German collections left. During this period, the Städel Museum's collection lost what is probably the most famous Van Gogh portrait of all, the portrait of Dr. Gachet, since its sensational auction in 1990 for the then world record price of $82.5 million. The painting has been in an accessible private collection. The alleged intention of his Japanese buyer to take the painting with him to his grave was fortunately prevented by his bankruptcy, which, one hears, forced the discreet sale of the painting to another private collection where one hopefully cultivates different funeral rituals. All that remains of the Gachet painting is the empty frame, but that at least we put on display for the exhibition. We still have it. And of course, we tell the story behind it. And of course, a few full frames, more than 120 artworks to be precise, including in excess of 50 key works by Van Gogh and 70 works by other artists of significance for modernism. In other words, you have good reason to get excited. I'd be delighted if we could all meet again in Frankfurt this autumn at the latest. That concludes my commercial break, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.